And before I introduce the amazing lecturer, Professor Chaim Goodman-Strauss, I'm going to put in a commercial for our next 2 sneak previews of Honors College Signature Seminars. A week from today, at the same time, same bat channel, same bat location, we will have Ed Miner giving a sneak preview of his Honors College Signature Seminar, Animal Minds. Does your cat feel jealousy? Do you worry about the emotional life of dogs? What is an octopus thinking about? It's going to be a super amazing course from somebody who works on the philosophy of animal minds. I love the academy, don't you? And 2 weeks from today, Dr. Lisa Corrigan will be here, and she's a professor of rhetoric, and the rhetoric is always great. And she's going to be talking about her course, Intimacies, which focuses on sexual and racial panics in American history post-1945. Why did the U.S. government decide to do surveillance on the private lives of African American leaders? How does social media control your vision of intimacy? It's going to be super amazing. But now my great pleasure in introducing my colleague, who I admire greatly, and many of you know as an absolutely brilliant mathematician. I'm afraid of math. How many mathematicians are in the room?
Several.
Oh my God, this is scary. I'm a poor medievalist. Math is a brilliant major. In fact, I think that you all know that. The companies know that. Law schools know that. Med schools know that. Like all these majors, it's not open-ended. And Chaim Goodman-Strauss has always been beautifully combining art and mathematics. And he has had an impressive run with all kinds of international connections, from Mexico to the south of France, spending a lot of time in Princeton, working with the top people in geometry in the world, and always being humble and down to earth. Weird. And adventurous. And so I think tonight you're going to hear about the adventure. So mathematics is important to this course, but I'm a historian, and what I love is when a mathematician decides to dip their toe, not just in history, but in prehistory and the longue durée of historical thinking through what is super hip right now, thing history. The history of things. A plastic cup, right? A paper clip, a dog leash, that's for next week, a string. And so I know, that Professor Goodman-Strauss is going to convince all of you that these little things have massive historical power. So let's give a big hand for Chaim Goodman-Strauss.
Thank you, Linda. It's a great pleasure to see you all here, and especially so many of you that I know. Let me just explain sort of the thesis of the. Let me just try to get this working. What is happening now? Where's Michael? Oh no.
It's not moving?
It was working just moments ago. Okay, well, we're just doing it this way. We'll just do it this way. Okay. So I'm interested in little things that are really kind of not sort of beneath our notice. I mean, I'm interested in this for a number of reasons. Partly, of course, it's really fascinating. As you said, there's quite a bit out there right now on the history of things. But there's a sort of another way that I would like to sort of propose to think about this, which I find really very moving, frankly, which is that these little things really are the products of millions of minds over tens of thousands of years building this kind of collective experience that we are all part of, that we really are not really so much as even individuals or individual cultures or individual whatever, that sort of from the grandest sweep of the grandest perspective, we are engaged in some sort of enterprise that's been going on for a very, very long time. And it's manifested collectively, and it's manifested through these little things. And so when I talk today, I'll try to show you what I'm talking about. One thing I just should say, as I know there's some historians in the room, it doesn't look like the paleontologists are here, that's good, and the anthropologists, I don't know, are here. So I'm not an academic paleontologist, historian, or anthropologist, but I'm a consumer of these kinds of things. I'm interested in them and I read a lot. But those of you who are academics in those areas, just bear with me and appreciate that. I don't know what I'm talking about on some level, but I've thought a lot about these things, and so hopefully, so we'll bring that same spirit to the class of exploration and kind of collectively figuring this out. So I do hope that some anthropology majors and history majors and others will come and inform me what's going on. Okay, good, this is working. So let's take a look at this needle here. I mean, this is something so easy to take for granted. If you look at this as sort of it's monumental on this screen. It's like, what, 8 or 10 feet tall. And that's maybe the scale where we can begin to appreciate the immense amount of engineering and design that's in this simple little thing. I mean, it's just a work of art at this scale. But even, I don't know if I can make, okay. So even like this groove here is very carefully shaped, right? Somebody, not just somebody, but many people over a great long period of time developed exactly what sort of the ideal form of this thing is. And of course, this little groove there is so that the thread can move back. One thing that is sort of not apparent is how many minds, how many technologies are really behind such a simple object as this. Let me tell you a few. So steel, for example, was not commonly available until just 150 years ago. Commercially, like large-scale production of needles and pins and nails, as opposed to simply hammering them out or carving them individually, requires the production of wire. Wire was not produced in any kind of reasonable quantities until about the 13th century. It took the invention of being able to figuring out metal through a hole. And then it wasn't just like somebody figured that out. Then there had to be refined and thought through and thought through and thought through in all subsequent time. And that's really, to me, amazing. So, not to mention, of course, figuring out all the things that you might use a needle on, or for, or with. All the kinds of different fabrics, cords, and other sorts of materials extending back. So fundamentally, what do we use a needle for? Obviously, we use it to sew. But what does sewing underpin? What technologies are sort of based upon sewing? Obviously, every one of us is highly familiar with clothing. And so, that's for starters. But basically, anytime you want to fasten flat sheets together, say that 37 times fast, you need to be able to sew them. And so, for example, even things that may not be obvious at all, but the codex, the book, requires the technology of the needle to have been perfected and thought through. All of this is sort of layered up upon itself. So how long has this been going on? Well, as far as clothing goes, we know that there's evidence of hides being scraped over nearly 500,000 years ago. For what purpose isn't necessarily clear. It's like one thing that's kind of clear for sure. There's not much real archaeological evidence, direct evidence of clothing per se, until I'll get to that. But one thing that is for sure is that clothing must have been worn regularly by some people, at least 70 to maybe 100,000 years ago. And the reason for that is very simple: lice. Genetic studies on lice show that the human louse, diverged into 2 species at least that long ago, just by using the standard genetic clocks. And why? Because one louse lives in one habitat, our hair, and another, this is disgusting, I know, but it's and another louse lives in a different habitat, our clothing. And they're different species. And they must have taken about that long to diverge, which is amazing, and it's a strange application of sort of an interdisciplinary thing. So, but more than that, we have other direct evidence that clothing must have been at least well-developed, highly well-developed by about 50,000 years ago. So this says, this is really truly caveat emptor. All of this is totally bogus in the fundamental sense that all paleontology has to be. Nobody really knows, and that these dates are constantly changing and being pushed back. And there's any number of academic debates that I'm going to touch upon where people have made their careers arguing with each other over all kinds of aspects of this. But some things are clear. It's absolutely clear that our species reached Europe around this time, for sure. all these are sort of lower bounds. One thing that paleontology definitely can do is establish lower bounds on when stuff happened, because the problem is that if you have the evidence, then you know that it happened then. We can use dating techniques and so on. But what's sort of much more controversial is when things are pushed back. And if anybody ever claims that they know the oldest example of whatever it is, you know they're crazy, because of course they don't. Nobody ever has the oldest example of whatever it is, because what are the odds you find that, right? So, but we do know many lower bounds, and so by 40,000 years ago, around that time, this was all covered in ice, right? It was gigantic ice sheets. Like, this is a great XKCD comic on that. It really puts it in perspective. This is a little later, 20,000 years ago. There's the skyline of Montreal and Boston and Chicago and Toronto. That's the scale of the ice sheets and how far south they were on this continent. I mean, it's crazy. And yet, we know for sure that people were living here, and just think about it. The people were the same physically as we are, for sure. They had the same body types as they were modern humans. The Neanderthals had been there a lot longer, but they had stockier, were more robust. It's a technical term and it's a meaningful term. Robust bodies, and presumably could live in colder environments. But we couldn't. I mean, just imagine going out up against an ice sheet like that, wearing some floppy robes made out of hides. It's crazy, right? So we had clothing. People had well-made clothing by those dates. They had to have. That's a long time ago. I mean, history we think of in this country as beginning maybe 150 years ago was the Civil War. I guess there was some stuff before that. Christ or the Romans, that was 2,000 years ago. Maybe the Sumerians, or maybe the development of writing and history proper beginning 5,000 years ago. Or the Neolithic, perhaps 10,000 years ago. This is much deeper in time. We had already these kinds of technologies, well developed enough that people could move into these regions. So one of the problems is that with the ice, so much ice, sea levels were dramatically lower. Now this is again later, and I said earlier, when at the maximum extent, the ice was like down here. But I chose this slide because it does a nice illustration of showing the problem that paleontologists face. And think about what it would have been like for the people to be here. There would have been all kinds of stuff. This would have been ideal terrain. Ergo, this is where all the stuff is. All the good stuff is now under hundreds of feet of water. Right? And like if people are moving down the coastlines to migrate into new regions, for example, if people were moving into North America steadily down the coastlines without moving into the interior, we'll never know. It's just complete. The only evidence that didn't happen is that people will go anywhere they can. So if they were moving down the coastlines, presumably they would have showed up in the middle of the continent. But all of this is lost. And to put that into perspective, just think about when all of the ice today is gone, which seems inevitable, sadly. Well, it's inevitable on geologic scales anyway. Ice has all gone and will go again, but whatever, if we do it ourselves. Imagine trying to understand the archaeology of Florida or the archaeology of New York. It's gone. It's gone. You can't do it. So what do we do with this stuff? We have no idea. So much is lost. We have absolutely no idea what that might be. But nonetheless, we know all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of stuff is being found, and it's really an amazing time. As somebody who's interested in paleontology, it's stunning the rate at which new discoveries are being made, like constantly. I mean, some of the things I'm going to be talking about are like 2 or 3 years old, and lots of these things are very much full of academic debate and lots of arguing and so on. But one thing that we have hundreds of, from hundreds and hundreds of sites, are these archaic needles. And they look pretty good, don't they? Yeah. And one thing that's really remarkable that I just learned, and doesn't seem to be commented upon, and I might, is in fact in this article here, that I got these from, is that some of these needles are actually from the Denisovian cave, where a new species of human was just identified 10 years ago. Okay? This isn't just about Homo sapiens, but other species of hominid, humans, other species of human beings at these technologies, which is very sobering. And so not only do we have this, but just to sort of put up, just to make it clear, of course, a needle's no good without string or rope, right? So string and rope has also been around for an enormously long period of time. And this is another fairly recent discovery from, I think that this was actually discovered many, many years ago, but only recognized in the last, like, 3 or 4 years. This is a rope-making tool from 40,000 years ago. And how do you know it's a rope-making tool? Because it's exactly the same tool that's used today for making rope. At least it's pretty similar. So rope is made traditionally today by, you have a board or something with holes. Typically today they're not arranged in a line, but in a row, a circular fashion. And the way you twist the fibers is you just move the thing around, twisting it. Or you hold it fixed and you pull the fibers through, twisting them as you go. And one very compellingly interesting thing is here you have these incredibly beautiful spirally cut things that took a tremendous amount of effort. And look at this. One of them's going counterclockwise, and the others are going clockwise. This is undoubtedly, that's how you get the fibers to hold together better. So this is actually a highly advanced technological piece of work from 40,000 years ago. And this is undoubtedly the product of an ongoing technological development that must have preceded this. This didn't just appear like this, right? I find it stunning and humbling and amazing that we have all of this from so long ago. And one thing that got me interested in this whole subject was about 20 years ago, I'd forgotten this until I was researching this, but I know I read this article in the New York Times on what was called the string revolution. And now since then, I've read quite a bit more about the string revolution, which is roughly that at this time, rather than talking about, Stone Age and hunting and all this kind of manly stuff, just sort of what really was going on was basically domesticity. And that if you think about what you can do once you can make string, you can make halters, you can make bags, you can make nets, you can make hats, you can make clothes, you can start weaving. And that all of this technological stuff was a tremendous advance forward for humanity, or all of us. And this is an important idea because when we think about a lot of what we're going to do in this course, I didn't realize really until I was preparing this talk, is that we're going to do a lot of sort of deconstructing our images of what all of this stuff must have been like. And I'm going to talk about another example of that in the second part of my talk. So this is roughly what you might have in mind. But this is wrong on so many ways, not least of which is that this is a Neanderthal, and it's clearly not, because no matter what, dogs were not domesticated by Neanderthals. Also, it's a man. And also, one really remarkable thing that I think is worth pointing out is that this haircut. So this is actually from an article we'll read called Bad Hair Days in the Paleolithic, which is a really interesting article which talks about that. Like, that we think of people at this time, of any sort, as being unkempt and just barbarians, right? And really, that's ridiculous. Hair, if you think, just to go very deep in time, hair is an evolutionary product. Human hair is weird stuff, biologically. It's not just to protect us from the sun, clearly, because it would only be kind of a mat. It'd be like a thin mat. It'd be just enough to protect us from the sun. Human hair, if you think about it, is meant to be styled by other human beings. Human hair requires the intervention of other humans with tools to make it work. It itself is not only an expression for us to culturally express ourselves and to indicate who we are and our position and status and all of this stuff, and our relation to our group, our social group, and our opposition to other social groups. And by the way, let me make a pitch for the lecture on black women's hair later this month, which I think is on the 24th. There's going to be a symposium or something in the Union, and I'm definitely going to be there because it's really fascinating. So this echoes right up to the modern day. So hair is just weird stuff. So here's a bunch of stuff. I actually got this off of Pinterest, really. And one of the things I'd like to do in the course is sort of deconstruct this a little bit. Yeah. You could spend a whole seminar on this, just this, right? And one thing is that this is sort of maybe the image you might have in mind of what life was like. But, this is absurd. Look how dangerous that is. Would you do that? What sane human being would do that? That's insane. Now, it seems to be incontrovertible that we did, in fact, kill all the large mammals pretty much in the world. And we're on the way to killing the rest of them, sadly, but we are. But it doesn't seem like we did it this way. We did it somehow by maybe killing all the young ones or something, who knows what, or disrupting the habitat. It's just not really clear, but we did not hunt them in this manner. What really is maybe a better picture of life in the Paleolithic is this, or actually most of these are pretty, they're maybe not necessarily factually accurate, and some of them are still kind of weird. But they are in pretty good sense of what really we should be after, which is that this is domestic life. It's the development over tens of thousands of years of all the domestic arts that make us truly able to live and exist in the way that we do. Just I included that as some ornament. Of course, ornament is a big part of that. And again, you know, here we have some sort of drawing of people trooping off into the north, which really happens in some fashion. Maybe not like that, but in some fashion. And then, of course, all of these amazing Venuses. And that brings me to the Venuses. So this is where the string revolution really got the, her name is Offer. Soffer, Olga Soffer, really brought attention to what had not been noticed in the male-dominated field of archaeology for a century or so, which is that these women, you know, are they like hot babe Paleolithic porn or something, or is it something else entirely? And obviously it's something else entirely, but how? Well, it had not been noticed. This is like, all of these are about the size, they fit comfortably in a hand. They're handheld items. So that gives you the scale. And all of them, or many of them, have these elaborate string work and rope work and what is either hair or hats. But if you look at the Venus of Willendorf, which is probably the most famous, that's not hair. If you look at it as a crocheted hat, it's obvious. And once you see it as a crocheted or knitted hat, you can't not see it as a crocheted or knitted hat. I mean, hair doesn't grow that way. These things are very finely made. Again, this is something that fits in the hand. That's about an inch across. Those are really carefully made thing. And so it's obviously illustrating something important. What is it? In fact, what's even weirder about these is that they don't tend to have faces. They don't tend to have arms or feet. But they do have these elaborately made headdresses. So it's some sort of, one of the authors, Elizabeth Whalen, says that perhaps these, she's joking, I think, that these might be like instruction manuals for making hats. But I obviously think that's just kidding. So this is another example that that many people made a lot of, and I'll talk about this. This is